Hey guys, in this video I'll be going over the radar and the F-14. There's two main types of radar modes. There's pulse mode and then there's all the Doppler modes. First, let's go over pulse mode. If you click this button, it switches it to pulse mode. And pulse mode is basically a raw radar display. It shoots radar waves out of the plane and it just shows whatever gets reflected back. This is good and bad. It's good because you can use it as an air-to-ground radar. Now, the radar in the Tomcat's not really designed to be an air-to-ground radar, but you can kind of use it that way. If you have it in pulse mode and you turn the erase down and you turn the pulse video up a little bit, you can see it can kind of map out the ground for you. And you can use this to set down target points or anything like that. That's the good thing about pulse mode, but pulse mode also has a bad thing. The bad thing is that because of all this clutter from the ground, it can make it hard to find air targets. It's not impossible, you can do it sometimes. It's just difficult because if there's an airplane out in front of you, you have to look at this and try to figure out what is the ground and what is the airplane. So because of that, the Tomcat has these Doppler modes right here. The way that the Doppler modes work is that they only show you targets that are moving. When the radar shoots out a radar wave, if the radar wave hits something that's not moving, the frequency comes back exactly the same. But if a radar wave hits something that's moving, the frequency can change. If the radar wave hits something that's moving towards it, the frequency can increase. And if it hits something that's moving away, then the frequency can decrease. So the way a Doppler radar works is that it filters out all the radar waves that come back at the same frequency. It only shows radar waves that have a different frequency when they come back. And that does two things. The first thing is that it only shows moving targets. And the second thing is that it filters out noise. Because most of the radar waves that come back with the same frequency are noise, and it filters all of that out. I'm going to switch to the most basic Doppler mode, which is pulse Doppler search. And you see when I switch to that, the display immediately looks different. This is because the Doppler modes use a different type of display than the regular pulse mode. You see, if I'm in pulse mode, then the display is pretty intuitive. Left and right is left and right in real life, and things on the bottom of the display are close to you and things on the top of the display are far away from you. But if I switch to any of the Doppler modes, the display is different. In the Doppler modes, left and right is still left and right in real life, but up and down depends on the speed of the target. Targets that are going towards you will be more up, and targets that are going away from you will be more down. So, for example, if you see a target on the very top of the screen in a Doppler mode, it means they're flying really fast towards you and they're probably going to shoot a missile at you. But if you see a target at the very bottom of the screen, it means they're trying to get away from you. Another thing you might notice in Doppler mode is you might see this line going back and forth. If you don't see it, you can set this switch to out, and you should see this line. Now, what is this? Remember that in Doppler mode, it separates the targets by their speed. So the higher up on the display, the faster something's going towards you, and the lower on the display, the faster it's going away from you. So what is this line going back and forth? This is basically a bunch of contacts that are all coming towards you at the same speed. What this line is that it's actually all the ground clutter. All this ground clutter right here, in Doppler mode, it's actually this line. Here's why. Remember that the Doppler mode only sees things that are moving. Even though the ground is not technically moving, it is moving from the perspective of the radar. And the reason why is because the plane is moving. So if your plane is flying at 400 knots, from the perspective of the radar, it looks like the ground is coming towards the radar at 400 knots. So since all these ground contacts in pulse mode are coming closer to us at the same speed, since they're all coming closer to us at 400 knots, in Doppler mode, they just show up as this line. If you want, you can set this switch up and it will filter that line out, and if you put it down to out, the line will come back. Now there's something really important you need to understand about the Doppler modes. The Doppler modes have two blind spots. The first blind spot is called the zero Doppler filter. Remember, the Doppler radar modes filter out anything that's not moving to get rid of noise. So if you're flying at 400 knots, and if there's a target in front of you also flying at 400 knots, and you're both flying in the same direction, let's say you're both going north, that is one of the blind spots of the Doppler radar. Because if you two are going at the same speed, then you're never getting any closer or farther away from the target. So from the perspective of the Doppler radar, it looks like it's not moving. And this actually has a range of plus or minus 100 knots. So just remember, this is the first blind spot. When you're flying, if there's someone in front of you flying in the same direction, whatever speed you're at, if they are within 100 knots of that speed, the Doppler radars will not be able to find them. For example, if you're going at 400 knots, if somebody's in front of you and they're flying anywhere between 300 to 500 knots, the Doppler radar cannot see them. So how do you get around that? Because that filter is part of how the Doppler system works, there's no way to turn it off. So if that's happening, there's two things you can do. The first thing is you can increase your speed to try to go a lot faster than them. and then see if they show up on your radar. The other thing you can do is switch to pulse mode, because remember, the pulse mode doesn't have any filters. So if you're in pulse mode, it doesn't matter if the target's going the same speed and direction of you. Since there's no filters in pulse mode, you can still see him. The only thing to keep in mind is that because pulse mode has ground clutter, the target might be mixed in the clutter. So you're gonna have to either find the target in the clutter, or you're gonna have to decrease your altitude to make sure that you're lower than him, and then point your radar up, because when the radar's pointed up, you don't have to worry about ground clutter anyways. So in summary, for the first blind spot, if someone's in front of you and they're going the same direction and speed as you, the Doppler radar modes are not going to see him. So you have to either speed up or you have to get below him and point your radar up and switch to pulse mode. Now let's go over the second blind spot. of the Doppler modes. I already mentioned earlier that this line here is all the ground contacts. So if someone is flying perpendicular to your radar beam, for example, I'm flying north here, so if someone is flying perpendicular to my radar beam like this, in that case, they will get mixed in with the ground clutter. And the reason why is because they're just moving this way. They're just moving east to west. They're not moving north or south like this. So from the perspective of the radar, they are moving closer to you at the same speed at which the ground is moving closer to you. So your radar is just going to pick them up as ground clutter. And this is actually a technique called notching. So if you ever hear someone talking about notching in DCS, what that really is just flying perpendicular to someone's radar beam so you show up as ground clutter. So what will happen is if they're doing that, they're going to get mixed in with this ground clutter beam here, and it's going to be hard to see them. It's going to be especially hard to see them if you have the filter turned on, because then they're just not going to show up at all. So what can you do to deal with this? The first thing you can do is turn the filter off. In some cases, turning the filter off will work because you might be able to pick them up in the ground clutter beam. They might be just above it and you can pick them up. However, if that doesn't work, what you can do is you can fly below them, make sure the ground clutter filter is turned off, and then since you're below them, you have to point your radar up to look at them. And if your radar's pointed up, obviously you don't have to worry about ground clutter. So the filter can be off and then you can see them. So that was the second blind spot of Doppler radars, which is called the notch. And in summary, if somebody's in the notch, you can turn the filter off and you can try to find them in the ground clutter, or you can decrease your altitude and point the radar up to look at them. And with the filter off, then you should be able to pick them up. One more difference between pulse mode and the Doppler modes is that because pulse mode has a lot more noise, it has a lot shorter maximum detection range. The maximum detection range for pulse mode is around 50 miles, whereas for the Doppler modes, it's around 100 miles. Those were the differences between pulse mode and the Doppler modes. There are different types of Doppler modes which have slight differences, but I'll go over those later. Now let's go over how to actually lock up a target. Targets on the radar will show up as little rectangles. As you can see, here's a target right here. First, you're going to need to have some controls binded. You're going to need to have the control for the movement of this stick right here. You can bind it with buttons with HCU forward, left, right, and backward, or you can bind it with axes, HCU left, right, and HCU up, down. The other thing you're going to need binded is these two, HCU half action and full action. If you have a two-stage trigger on your stick, I'd recommend binding the first stage to half action and the second stage to full action. What you need to do to lock something is go next to your stick and click this button that says radar. Then you need to find your target. Here's my target right here. Then you need to hold down half action and move your cursor over to where your target was. And when you find him, you do full action. And if you get a lock, then you're going to see this bar and you're going to see these lights come on. And you can see it'll automatically switch to single target track mode. If you want to unlock a target, all you do is press half action, and then it will unlock it. And locking the target from this radar screen is the same for any of these modes. For example, if I go to regular pulse mode, with pulse mode, it'll be harder to find the target because of the ground clutter, but you can still lock it like normal once you find it. I think I actually saw it right here. So let me do half action, move over, and full action, and it looks like we got a lock. If you try to lock something but there's nothing there, then it will just go back to a regular scan. I've already gone over pulse search and pulse Doppler search. Now let's go over the other Doppler modes. First, we have RWS, which is range while search. RWS is basically the same thing as pulse Doppler search. The only difference is that RWS does some extra filtering to give you the range of the target. Also, if you're in pulse Doppler search, you'll see the target come up here, but it won't show up here. But if you're in range while search, the target will also show up down here. Now right now you can see I have a million targets popping up, which doesn't make any sense. That's because that's that ground clutter. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the filter to cut out the ground clutter. And you can see everything go away. And then once it finds the target, it should show up down here. As you can see, it picked up the target and now it's showing it right here. Now when you see your targets down here, you're going to see a number on the left. The number on the left of it is the approximate altitude in tens of thousands of feet. So for example, this target is at approximately 10,000 feet. However, keep in mind that the approximation is pretty big. For example, the target that was here earlier had a 1, which is approximately 10,000 feet. But in reality, what that means is that target could be anywhere between 5,000 to 15,000 feet. And if I click on the target here, you can see it's actually at 6,500 feet. One last thing to note is that if you're in range while search, it will have slightly less range than pulse Doppler search because of the extra processing. Pulse Doppler search can see targets out to about 110 miles, whereas range while search can only see targets out to around 90 miles, which obviously isn't a huge difference. It's just something to consider if you're trying to find things that are super far away. The last type of Doppler radar mode is TWS, or track while scan. Track while scan mode is basically the same thing as RWS. The only difference is that in track while scan, you can actually select your track files down here. For example, if I go to RWS and then I click TID cursor, if I do half action and put my cursor over the target and do full action, I can't select it. That's because in RWS mode, even though it builds track files down here, you can't interact with them. If you want to lock something, you still have to do a single target track lock by locking them from this screen here. But if you are in track while scan mode, you can actually use your cursor to select the targets like this. So you can fire at targets without necessarily having to have a single target track lock. Also, track while scan is the only radar mode where you can fire multiple Phoenix missiles and have them being guided toward multiple targets at the same time. Other than that, track while scan is pretty similar to range while search. They both have a maximum range of around 90 miles. Now you may notice there's two different types of track while scan. There's auto and manual. If you're in manual mode, then you control the radar manually with these switches here. For example, I can decrease the scan zone. If you're in track while scan automatic, then as targets populate on your radar, the plane will automatically adjust the radar settings to get the best scan over your target. Most of the time you're probably going to be in track while scan auto, because if you fire a Phoenix missile in track while scan manual mode, it will automatically switch to auto mode anyways. Another thing to note about track while scan is that once it detects targets you're able to engage, it will assign priority numbers. For example, I have 2 targets here. Now the altitude numbers are on the left, but the priority numbers will show up on the right. For example, if this has a number 1 on the right and this has a number 2 on the right, that means this target is the first priority. Now you might be wondering, what is the use of RWS? It seems like TWS is the same thing, but just better. There are some minor differences between the two. The advantages of TWS are what I already went over. With TWS, you can select your targets down here, and also TWS allows you to guide multiple Phoenixes at the same time. The advantages of RWS is that it can track more targets at the same time. RWS can track up to 48 targets at once, and for TWS, I think it was around 24. Now in DCS, most of the time you're probably not going to be dealing with that many targets at once anyways. It's just one of the differences. Also, supposedly in real life, TWS is not really as accurate as RWS, but in DCS, I don't think it makes much of a difference. So there are some trade-offs between TWS and RWS, but in DCS, TWS is generally better, and you're probably going to be using that more often. Those were the differences between the types of radar modes. Now I'll go over some other radar functions. First, I'll go over the IFF, or the Identify Friend-Foe system. This allows you to tell if you're looking at a friendly or a hostile. As you can see, my 2 targets are showing up right here. When you hold down the IFF button, which is this, if it detects the targets are friendlies, then it'll show 2 bars above and below the target. As you can see, these are both being marked as friendlies. Now let's go over some of the extra controls for the radar. First of all, this control right here is for the target size. You can select a small, normal, or large target. I'm assuming normal would be something like a fighter jet, and small would be maybe a helicopter, and large would be maybe a bomber, but I'm not really sure. The manual didn't really explain it. Next is the MLC, or main lobe clutter. I already went over this earlier. This is what filters out the ground clutter. If you set it to out, it will turn it off. You can see the ground clutter strobe. If you set it all the way up, it turns the filter on, and the ground clutter strobe will go away. If you set it to auto, then it will be based on the radar elevation. If your radar's pointing down, it will automatically turn on the filter, and if it's pointing more than 3 degrees up, it will automatically turn the filter off. These 2 switches don't do anything, and all these switches on the left don't do anything either. Next, there's the pulse video and pulse gain switches. In the Doppler modes, these don't do anything, but they do affect the pulse mode. These switches affect the darkness of the returns, so if I turn the pulse video all the way up, you can see the returns are really dark now, and I can make them darker by turning up the pulse gain. Also, if you have the pulse gain set all the way right to norm, then it will automatically control the gain. Next, there's the brightness and erase switches. The brightness is pretty straightforward. It just adjusts the brightness of the display. And by the way, if it's dark outside, you can click on the display to apply the night filter. Erase controls how fast the contacts are removed from the display. The erase switch affects the pulse mode and also the Doppler modes. If I turn the erase all the way up, you can see all the contacts are removed from the display very quickly. But if I turn it all the way off, then you can see they stay there for a really long time. I'd probably leave this in the middle, except if you're using pulse search to map out the ground, you might want to turn it all the way off. Then there's these two switches here, the aspect switch and the closing velocity switch. The aspect switch adjusts what speeds the Doppler mode can identify. If you have it set to nose, then it can identify targets with a maximum opening speed of 600 knots and a maximum closing speed of 1800 knots. Now remember, here's our ground returns, so if something's up here, the target's going towards you, which means it's closing. If something's down here, it's going away from you, which means opening. So when you have it in the nose position, it prioritizes closing speed. So basically, in the nose position, it's meant more for looking for targets that are flying towards you. If you set it to tail, it's the opposite. In tail, the max opening speed it can detect is 1800 knots, and the max closing speed is 600 knots. And if you set beam, it's 1200 for opening and closing. So basically, if you're looking for a target and you know they're flying towards you, set it to nose. And if you know they're flying away from you, set it to tail. Also, according to the manual, this switch can affect countermeasures. It says if there's a target that's using chaff to try to confuse your radar, you can set it to nose. And when the radar locks them, it will focus mainly on radar reflections around the nose of the plane to try to not get distracted by the chaff. For this switch on the right, it's supposed to affect the scale of the display. For normal, the scale is supposed to be from 200 knots opening to 1000 knots closing. X4 is 800 knots opening and 4000 knots closing. And vid is 50 knots opening and 250 knots closing. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, but for me, it doesn't seem like this switch really does anything. I've been messing around with it and I can't seem to get the switch to change anything. But anyways, I think the way you're supposed to use this switch is leave it in normal, and if you know that something's flying away from you, then you can switch it to X4. Next, there's these range buttons on the top. Now remember, in the Doppler modes, the display works based on the speed of the objects it finds. So the higher up on the display, the faster things are coming towards you, and the lower, the faster they're going away from you. So because of that, if you're in any of the Doppler modes, the range buttons don't do anything. If you are in the pulse mode though, then the range buttons affect how far out you can see on the display. I've already gone over all the buttons except for this one. This is the IR button, which is something from an older version of the Tomcat. So in our Tomcat, it doesn't do anything. And these knobs up here don't do anything either. Those were the radar controls for the main panel, but there are also some controls over here on the left. This is the stabilization switch. If you have it set up, then the radar will be stabilized to the horizon. And if you have it set out, then the radar will be stabilized to your plane. Keep in mind though that if you're in any of the Doppler modes, the radar is always stabilized to the horizon no matter what. So this switch only does anything if you're in pulse mode. Next we have these centering switches. The azimuth center switch allows you to adjust the center of the radar. As you can see, I can move it left and right, but I would probably just leave it in the middle. And this switch here adjusts the radar elevation. And as you move the elevation switch up and down, you can see this white arrow on the right will move up and down. You can also fine-tune the elevation. If you bind these three switches, HCU thumb down, up, and recenter, you can press down and up to adjust the elevation in small increments, and you can press recenter to bring it back to the middle. You may have noticed this arrow on the left that's constantly going up and down. That shows where the radar is scanning in the sky. And that is actually controlled by this switch here that says elevation bars. The more elevation bars you set it to, the more altitude in the sky it will scan. For example, if I set it to 1 bar, you can see it's not moving anymore because it's just scanning back and forth in a narrow slice of the sky. If I set it to 2 bars, you can see now it just moves up and down. And if I set it to 8 bars, you can see now it jumps through multiple positions and then it eventually goes back to the bottom, because it's scanning different slices of altitude through the sky. So basically, the more bars you have, the more of the sky it will scan, but it will also take longer to complete a scan. Then there's the azimuth scan switch. This adjusts how wide it scans back and forth. You can set it from 10 degrees, that will be a very narrow scan, and you can set it all the way up to 65 degrees back and forth. Now keep in mind, the azimuth scan and the elevation bars settings are mainly for the different modes like RWS and PD search, but if you are in track while scan, There's only two settings track while scan can be in. It can be in a 4-bar 20-degree search or a 2-bar 40-degree search. For example, even though I set it to 65, since I'm in track while scan, it's doing a 20-degree search. That's because right now it's in the 4-bar 20-degree mode. And if I switch it to 2 bars, you can see it's still scanning 4 bars. And the reason why is because I also have to set this one to 40. And then it will switch it to the 2-bar 40-degree mode. This switch that says VSL is for the vertical scan mode, but I'll go over that a little bit later. There's also this switch that says slave, but that has to do with the camera system, so I'll go over that later too. Next, let's go over some of the functions for the TID. You can adjust the brightness here and also the contrast, but the contrast is more for the tactical camera system. There's a cursor you can move around on the TID using your stick. First, you have to click this button that says TID cursor, and then you hold down half action and you can move the circle around and you can press full action on any target you want. And when you do that, it'll give you information about the target up here. If you want to unlock a target, you can press half action and release, and it will unlock it. Then there's these two buttons right here. The button on the left is the track hold button. Normally, whenever your radar finds something, it will show up here for 14 seconds. And then after 14 seconds, it will go away unless the radar scans it again. If you enable track hold though, then it will keep your targets here for 2 minutes, even if the radar doesn't scan them again. Then there's this button that says collision steering. If you enable this button, then it will give the pilot steering information towards the target. Next, there's these buttons down here. This first button doesn't do anything. You can use this button to remove the altitude numbers from the targets. This button removes all the symbols from the TID and replaces them with a dot. This button can activate data link symbols, but I won't be going over that in this video. This button activates jamming strobes. If your plane detects that it's being jammed, there will be a line coming out of your plane, which is this symbol right here, and it will be going towards the jamming source. Also, if your plane detects a jamming target, then on this little graph right here, there will just be a straight line going up. If you click the non-attack button, then it will remove all the symbols that your plane can't attack. It will also remove friendly symbols. If you click the velocity vector button, it will remove the velocity vectors from the targets. As you can see, the target has a little line coming out which shows where it's going, and if I click the velocity vector button, it removes that line. And lastly, there's the launch zone button. If you press that, it activates these really long lines. As you get closer to the target, this line will go down, and there's 2 dots on the ends, and there's a box in the middle. Once the line gets past the first dot, it means you're within the maximum range to fire at the target. Once it gets within the box in the middle, it means you're at the optimum range to fire. And once it passes the second dot, it means you've passed the minimum range, so you can't fire anymore. This switch here affects what the TID looks like. If you put it onto aircraft stabilized, that will just be the normal display. If you put it onto ground stabilized, then it will be a north-up display. If you put it into attack, it's the same thing as aircraft stabilized, except it will add a horizon line here. And if you put it into TV, it will show the video feed from the camera, but I'll go over that later. And then the range switch is pretty obvious. It shows the maximum range. You might be wondering why you can see out to 400 miles even though the radar can't see that far. The reason why is in case you're connected to a data link system that's showing targets for you. Another thing to note is that you can move the center of the display. This circle here is my actual aircraft. You need to have this button binded, HCU offset. If you have TID cursor selected, then you can hold half action and move your cursor somewhere. Then press full action to drop your cursor right there, and if you press the offset button, then you can offset your display. This also works in the ground stabilized mode. If you want to reset your display, then you can just set it back to aircraft stabilized or ground stabilized. Next, we have this panel right here. This is the stick itself, which I've obviously already went over. And this is what you select the stick to interact with. If you have it set to TID cursor, it will interact with this screen here. If you have it set to radar, you can use it to manually lock things from here. If you have it set to IRTV, then it can adjust the TV camera, which I'll go over later. And if you have it set to DDD cursor, then when you're in pulse mode, if you hold down half action on your stick, you can adjust a little crosshair here. And you can use full action to place the crosshair down, and from there you can do things like a navigation fix, which I already went over in my navigation video. Also, if you press half action again, it will release the crosshair. These are the power switches right here. The one on the left is for the camera system, and the one on the right is for the radar and the computer system. Keep in mind for the one on the right, if you have it on standby, the computer will be on, but the radar will be off. And if you put it to transmit, then the radar will be on. There's also these lights right here. The one on the left is the camera overheat light. This will turn on if the camera gets too hot. The one in the middle is the power reset light. If that comes on, then there's some problem with the circuit in the plane, and you need to click this button to reset it. and the one on the right is the standby light for the radar. If you have the radar on, but the standby light is on, it means the radar is still warming up. And if you press this button, you can test all the lights. If you go to this panel and set it to target data, you can mark information about the targets for yourself. If I set this to TID cursor, I'm going to go ahead and mark this guy right here. If I know this is a friendly, I can go and click friend, and you can see there's a circle on top, and there are some other options here you can choose. From the pilot seat, if you set this switch to TID, you can see the Rio's screen. This could be a good thing, especially if you're playing in single player, because you can have more situational awareness. Also, if you're playing alone, you can control the radar from the Jester menu. If you open the Jester menu and go to BVR, you can control the radar options from this menu. Obviously, you don't have as precise control as if you were in the back seat. It just gives you a way to control the radar if you're playing alone. The last thing to go over with the radar is the ACM, or Air Combat Maneuvering modes. These are the close range radar modes. There's 4 of them. There's PLM, which is pilot lock-on mode, PAL, which is pilot automatic lock-on, MRL, which is manual rapid lock-on, and then there's also the vertical scan mode. First, I'll go over PLM. You need to have this button binded, PLM button. While you hold down that button, what you need to do is put this cross over a target, and the radar will lock the first thing it sees out to 5 miles. And if you let go of the button, then it will release the PLM mode. Next thing is PAL, or pilot automatic lock-on. You need to have this button binded, target designate forward PAL. This is kind of similar to PLM. The only difference with this is you don't have to hold the button, you can press it. And also with the PLM mode, we had to put the cross on the target, but in the PAL mode, as you can see, the radar will scan back and forth like this. If you want to exit PAL mode, you can just press the button again. Next, I'll go over the vertical scan mode. Vertical scan mode can actually be entered from the pilot seat or the Rio seat. For the pilot seat, you need these 2 bindings, target designate up and down. If you press target designate down, it will enter vertical scan low mode, and you can see the radar will scan this area of the HUD. And if you set it to up, it will do vertical scan high mode, and in high mode, it will scan up here. From the Rio seats, you have to have these 2 buttons binded, VSL low and high, and you activate them just like how the pilot does. You can press VSL low, or you can press VSL high, and it will lock onto the first thing it sees. From the Rio seats, if you want to exit vertical scan mode, you can just press any of these radar modes right here. The last one to go over is MRL. MRL is only available for the Rio, and you have to have this button binded. If you press the MRL button, then you can see the scan right here, and you can control it with your stick. When you find a target, you can press full action to lock it. If you want to exit MRL mode, you can either press half action, or you can just press one of these buttons here. Keep in mind, all the air combat maneuvering modes will lock a target out to 5 miles. The only exception is the pilot automatic lock-on, which can see targets out to 15 miles. That was everything to go over with the radar. Now let's go over the TCS, or the tactical camera system. The TCS is this camera on the front of the plane. You can power on the TCS with this switch here. And if you want to see the video display, you set this switch to TV. Then you can adjust the brightness and the contrast to get the best picture. And if you want to control it, you click the IRTV button, and you hold down half action on your stick, and then you can move the camera around. If you release half action, it'll go back to the middle. If you want to lock something with the TCS, you have to look at this switch here. There's manual, auto, and auto search. If you're in manual and you want to lock something, you have to hold half action, slew the TCS or the airplane, and then press full action to lock it. If you're in auto, then you don't have to have the TCS looking exactly at the airplane. As long as the airplane is somewhere within the field of view, when you press full action, it'll lock it. And if you have it in auto search, then when you hold down full action, the camera will start moving around, and if the airplane enters the field of view, it'll automatically lock. There's also some more controls for the TCS right here. You can adjust the field of view of the TCS with this switch. If you have it set to wide, it'll be a 4 times field of view. If you have it set to narrow, it'll be a 10 times. Most of the time though, you're probably not going to be manually controlling the TCS. You're probably going to be using it in slave mode. If you look at this switch here, if you have it set to independent, then the TCS and the radar can move independently of each other. If you have it set to TCS, then if the radar gets a lock, the TCS will automatically move to look at what the radar's locked onto. If you have it set to radar, it's the opposite. The radar will automatically move to look at what the TCS is locked onto. Most of the time though, you're probably going to be using it in TCS mode, because you're probably going to be locking things with the radar, and then you're going to have the TCS slave to it to identify the airplane. For example, if I lock this plane right here, it's kind of hard to see because it's so far away, but now the TCS is looking at the plane. There's also the trim switches here. These are used in case the TCS is not aligned with the radar. If I lock something with the radar and the TCS is tracking it, but it seems a little bit off, it's not exactly in the center, you can use the trim switches to adjust it, but it should be aligned perfectly in DCS, so you shouldn't need to use these trim switches. Now that I'm closer to the target, you can more clearly see it in the TCS. That was radar for the F-14. Thanks for checking out this video, and I'll see you later.